All right, I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kyle Kondik. I'm a managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. We've got a great panel today that I think is very topical as to a major question in elections, which is how are we going to conduct this election in the midst of a pandemic going on now that very well could be with us in November. This panel is presented both by the UVA Center for Politics, but also the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at UVA. And it's part of our ongoing series with the Center for Politics and the Batten School, Democracy in Perilous Times, Unprecedented Challenges and Controversies. And I think certainly it's fair to say that this is an unprecedented challenge and very well may feature unprecedented controversies going forward here, which we're going to try to dive into with our panelists. So let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll just start the program. Let me start with Lee Goodman. He's former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Lee is also a University of Virginia graduate, which we are obligated to mention. Myrna Pérez, director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program. Charles Stewart, professor of political science at MIT and director of MIT's Election Data and Science Lab, and Matthew Weil, director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Elections Project. And so let's just dive right in, and I'm going to direct the first question to Charles. And so, of course, many states ended up postponing their primaries once shelter-in-place orders and other government guidance on congregating together was issued. One state that did not was Wisconsin, which held their election on Tuesday, April 7th, although we ended up not getting results for that election until April 13th. Charles, you've written some things after the election about how it went, and so I'm just kind of curious, what do you think sort of lessons we could learn from Wisconsin? How do you think the Wisconsin experience went, and what maybe can it teach us for November?
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks for having me in the panel on. As a political scientist, I oftentimes quip that what's bad for the country is good for business. And I think that the Wisconsin situation, while it was, I would say at best, unfortunate, the circumstances under which they voted, it was good to the degree that the rest of us could see what happens when you do vote in the middle of a pandemic and that you're scrambling to deal with that fact. And so with that said as background, and I'm assuming that the audience is broadly aware of the facts there, and so I won't recount all of them, I think that first of all, it has to be said that there was a lot that happened there that was unfortunate. That is to say, putting people at risk because they didn't have to, because it was hard to vote by mail, harder in Wisconsin than in many states. Ballots that did not get returned for a variety of reasons, and those sorts of things were unfortunate. On the positive side, there was near historic turnout in the primary, so it does show an eagerness of people to turn out and vote. There was nonetheless a record number of mail ballots, and there is also, and all of that was supported by what I just have to say is an extraordinary effort on the part of election administrators in the state to overcome, the virus and court decisions and the difficult situation they were put in. So it showed us how that it is possible to respond to the election in this time of COVID. As I say, though, I've written, don't try this at home. I don't think this is a model. Other than showing that some of the most difficult things that we need to do in order to vote safely and securely are in fact possible to do if we have time to plan it properly.
Lee, I want to direct the next question to you. And just as a little bit of background, one trend in American political life and elections that has been pretty clear, certainly before the public health crisis, is just that there are significantly more people who vote, before election day. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission found in 2017 the percentage of votes cast early or through absentee voting or by mail jumped from about 20% just in 2004 and almost doubled to about 40% in 2016. So I guess I think it's fair to say that there's generally been a trend toward more kind of expanded early absentee voting options. I guess the question I would direct to you is that, I guess, what more could or should we do to build on these existing options?
Well, certainly picking up on where Charles left off, we do have time to begin looking at what works in other places, what has worked. And I think there are several traditional, well-established tools in the toolbox that both afford voters expansive choices in exercising their franchise, also that incorporate integrity mechanisms and protocols for a secure election, and also that are well trod administratively and might alleviate burden of shifting all at once to one system. I've always defaulted to a system that has a diverse range of voting mechanisms, and that's my home state here in Virginia. The ideal historical voting system, of course, is opening a precinct and allowing people to come vote in person on election day. That affords voters the ability to watch the campaigns to the very end and make their decision up on election day. And there are some voters who prefer to vote that way. There are many voters who also prefer to vote that way because they are secure that in the chain of custody of their vote, they can see their vote being placed in the tabulator or cast there in the precinct. I don't think we should plan on abandoning precincts at this time. Certainly by November, there will be people who are immune. Hopefully this virus will recede and we can have an in-person election on election day in 2020. Now, we have been able to expand mechanisms for voting over a long period of time, and people have become accustomed, as you say, to voting early. And many of us, many of the viewers here, probably know right now today how they plan to vote in the major federal elections next November. And those people ought to be afforded the right to vote early or by absentee ballot. And we can discuss the distinctions between early voting versus absentee voting. But for all practical purposes, in administering an election, they're the same. And on election day, of course, in Virginia, we have a method called curbside vote. If you're elderly or feeble, you can drive up to your precinct, wave out a person who will bring a ballot to your car. You don't necessarily have to walk into the precinct to vote. They will take your vote at the curb in the car and walk your ballot back in for you. That is, an election officer does that. Now, expanding to absentee and early voting, one mechanism that is well established is early voting in person, where you go to your local registrar's office, or in Virginia, we have Fairfax County, which is a very large landmass, and they'll set up 3, 4, or 5 different locations for 45 days before the election. And you can go in on any day, including a Saturday, and you can vote in person using the traditional mechanisms of in-person voting. You present yourself, they check you off the poll book as having voted, and you vote in person. And I've done that a lot in my own voting history, and I can tell you, it's never taken more than 5 minutes to get in and out because they are not crowded, because they're essentially precincts open 45 days before an election. Then you get into the mechanism of vote by mail. And we've established a system where people in most states, some states have gone to a little different system. There are pros and cons of doing universal mail voting. But at least for this election, I think states should look at amplifying and the absentee or early mail voting. And there you apply for a ballot, you get your ballot, you place it in an envelope, and you have multiple ways to return your ballot. You can return it any day before the election at the local registrar's office. And you could have a drop-in box, so there's very little personal contact in doing that. You can have a family member drop that ballot off for you. You can deliver that absentee ballot to your precinct just like the curbside voting on election day. And of course, you can mail in your ballot. In most states, the ballot has to be received by election day. I understand that's a point of contention for some. But you can do that as well. Those are all well-established mechanisms that have security provisions, established. And I think states should be looking at providing a whole menu of measures for people to vote, to expand the franchise and get to an accurate result.
Matt, despite the overall movement toward more early and mail-in voting options, I think you recently noted that in about 2/3 of the states, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, about 2/3 of the states, less than 15% of the ballots are cast by mail in those states. And so, if in fact there were states that wanted to ramp up to holding an all mail-in election, as some states out west already do, how hard would that be? And is that even something that would be plausible to do in states that don't already have robust mail-in voting?
Well, first, thank you for having me here. I think I would say no. It's not possible for every state at this point to get to all mail voting. As you mentioned, there are 5 states. You have Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii, who have spent considerable resources in planning to get to where they are to have all mail elections. And by all mail elections, what that means is every voter in the state is getting a ballot through the mail automatically. There's no application process. That's just how they get their ballot. It just happens automatically. And as Lee mentioned, there are a bunch of really time-tested and good options for turning the ballot. Some of those states prepay the postage for the return ballots. Some have drop boxes either at local elections offices, or you can bring it to the polls. Those drop boxes could be throughout the jurisdiction. They've spent some time doing that and created the security and the policies and the procedures to make it actually work. To think that every state could get there in 6.5 months is probably unrealistic. Right now, we have about 15 states that still require an excuse to access absentee balloting. We're seeing some states expand the reasons to include fear of COVID-19. I think that's a reasonable option, but not even every state is doing that. Certainly, if you look to Texas today, they are involved in litigation over whether or not fear of getting COVID-19 will qualify as an excuse to get an absentee ballot. I think that's probably the wrong stance. I think we have to assume that voters are going to be in a position where they are going to have reasonable and rational concerns about going to polling places. And so trying to figure out how to move those states a little further. Then there are the states in between the all-mail voting and the excuse. Those are the no-excuse voting states where anyone could access an absentee ballot already. And even in those states, like you mentioned, the vast majority of states just don't see a whole lot of voting by mail. And so they know how to deal with the levels of 10 or 15% of voting by mail. If those numbers spike to 50%, and you have all those voters sending in applications, and those applications have to be processed, ballots have to be sent out because they're not done automatically, I do think we're going to have some administrative concerns getting ballots out on time. We certainly saw that in Wisconsin, and I think we could see that times 50 if policymakers aren't going to give the resources to the election officials that they need to run these elections well.
Myrna, let me direct this one to you. If in fact states, were to move toward more heavier mail-in voting, and maybe that even might come at the expense of providing options to people to vote in person, do you think that has some sort of discriminatory effect on certain people, certain kinds of voters? And what should states be keeping in mind as they consider what changes they end up making to make sure that those changes are as inclusive as they can be?
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you to the UVA for having me. I want to take a bit of issue with what my friend Matthew just said, and just to make sure that the audience appreciates the difference between moving to a system where everybody votes by mail and moving to a system where more people have the option of voting by mail. And it's really important that in the crisis that we are facing right now, that politicians, local election administrators, political leaders at the state and federal level work very hard to give voters more options, not fewer. And in the crisis that we are facing right now, we need to make sure that polling places persist for a whole bunch of reasons, which I'll get into in a minute, but also that people do not have to choose between the fundamental right to vote and being able to vote safely, which will mean expanded vote by mail opportunities. It is entirely correct that whenever change is rolled out, It's going to have some wrinkles, especially if that change is happening quick and in an unexpected way. We saw this when states moved to vote centers. We've seen this when states have been enacting strict photo ID laws. It takes a while for voters, especially low information voters and voters that have language or other access issues, to be able to respond to the change in policy. But that should not be an excuse for politicians and local election administrators to be doing their level best to make sure that our election goes off smoothly. There are a few reasons why, and I think most on this panel agree, we need to make sure that we have meaningful in-person polling place options as we expand vote by mail. Some of those are because the mail system is unreliable for certain communities. If you live on a Native American reservation, the way the post office understands your address is going to look differently than the way your tribe understands your address. In very rural areas or very densely populated urban areas, people cannot count on their mail with the same sort of reliability that high-income suburbs can count on their mail. If you have a visual or physical impairment, voting by mail without the kind of technology that often is by law required to be in polling places is going to be a challenge for you. If you are a person that prefers to conduct your business in a language other than English, there are places in the country that are required under federal law to be able to provide translating assistance, which doesn't happen well right now via mail. So for all of these reasons, we need to make sure that we have policies that work for our very diverse communities. I also want people to not forget about the fact that it's not just election day we need to make sure that people have access to, it's registration opportunities. Right before an election, all of us would see enterprising, teenagers in brightly colored t-shirts standing on streets asking people, are you registered to vote? Or you would be asked outside grocery stores, or when you went into the driver's license office, they would ask you, do you want to register to vote? Those things are not happening right now. And we cannot be satisfied that folks who are eligible to vote not have the opportunity to register to vote prior to this election. So we need to be we need to be able to look at the election system as a holistic entity and look at the different places where people might get shut out and make sure that we accommodate the changes that are going to be required because of the coronavirus in a way that brings everybody in and gives everybody the opportunity to be able to cast ballots that will count and to participate in a meaningful way. Our elections are too important to just decide that, we're going to be satisfied with Band-Aids. Like, we actually need to have the preparation and the planning and the resources to make sure that our election runs smoothly and that it's robust and participatory and includes all of our diverse voices.
Speaking of resources, as part of the massive federal recovery legislation, Congress included about $400 million for states to use toward the election. Kamala Harris just today, U.S. Senator Democrat from California, proposed like a $5 billion bill to sort of address some of these issues. Do we think the federal government is doing enough here to kind of provide states with the funding that they might need to offer these expanded options? And this is a question that anyone can address if you'd like.
Well, I'll start, and I would say no in a couple of ways. One, we know that just the basic blocking and tackling of expanding access to voting by mail, even in the states that are eager to do it, leave aside for the moment the states where it's a struggle, the $400 million that was appropriated would not even cover the marginal expenses necessary to do that. So what's been appropriated already is really inadequate. You put on top of that the fact, and few people understand this, that money appropriated so far requires a state match, and there's struggles right now over getting those monies appropriated. And so there's a real question about whether the money can be released to the states and localities that need it soon enough. So on the money side, definitely no. I mean, I think there are some things the federal government is doing well. There's a coordination effort among the states and localities that's that's happening in a number of places, and some of that's happening through Homeland Security, the Election Assistance Commission, et cetera. So that's a really important function that's being played now to coordinate and provide information to election officials. But with respect to providing the resources at this time that state and local budgets are tanking, I think that's a real concern.
And if I could jump in, I would completely agree with Charles, but I would also urge folks to be putting pressure on Congress to be able to get funds to our local and state election administrators. But we also need not to forget the advocacy that needs to happen in the states. We need to make sure that state legislators are also feeling the pressure to ensure that our elections are free, fair, and accessible. We need to make sure that folks are taking the extra effort to communicate to various voters who are not going to be in the same sort of channels or in the room that some of these conversations are happening. And that is a job for all of us, not just laying that solely at the feet of Congress. But we do all need to be focusing our advocacy on getting federal dollars down to the states and local election administrators as quickly as possible, because they need to start the planning and they need to know what they have in order to be able to do that.
Yes,
yeah,
and
if I could just add on to that as well. The one thing I will say that was good about what Congress did was they were very flexible with the funds. And as I mentioned, there are just very different places where states need the assistance. And so not being overly prescriptive was good. Charles mentioned the state matching problem. That's going to be a huge issue in states that have already adjourned their state legislatures where they need state legislative action. And I agree completely with Myrna that we should be on those states to be doing all they can. But I also want to note that the time is not 6 months, really. I mean, states have extraordinarily long timelines that they have to follow to purchase anything. They need this money and they need to know it's coming pretty much right now if we're going to be making any kind of large expenditures. And there are so many large ones that they might have to make if they're going to be expanding absentee voting. They just really can't wait much more than a couple months, and that's going to be pushing it pretty close to the deadline.
Yes, and Kyle, I think that election administration has been systemically underfunded for a long, long time. And, it only becomes an issue when there's a problem, and they avoid problems almost in spite of their funding and resources almost every election cycle. And so this isn't necessarily a coronavirus problem. This is a systemic problem that people minimize on the priority list. After education, after police, election administration always falls at the bottom of everyone's list. So we need more resources regardless of any transitions in voting mechanisms and administration of this election. I will say this. This will be a important time for corporations and civic organizations to step up and provide volunteers to help administer this election. We've had a good track record in Virginia of companies like State Farm Insurance and others who make their whole employee base available on election day. And they go to trainings and they become election officers. In many states, the political parties get to nominate officers of election to serve. The political parties are going to have to step up here. And Myrna mentioned registration. I think there's going to be a premium on the political parties and their get out the vote and registration drives in this season as well. So this is sort of an all hands on deck opportunity to strengthen our election administration system more generally.
This also brings up another point, I think, which is that I think a lot of times, particularly because the federal government seems to just take up so much people's attention in the presidency and Congress and all that, maybe less so than their state or local governments. But I do think it's important to note that, at least as I sort of interpret it, that, the election, administering elections is really more of a state and local government kind of function. If the federal government wanted to actually tell the states that, hey, you need to offer much more mail-in voting or change access to voting procedures, is that even something the federal government could or should do?
Could, yeah. unlikely for a wide variety of reasons. And I mean, sometimes actually, I think unlikely for the right reasons, but whether, I mean, this is in some ways to underscore Myrna's point, but although I don't know if this is the point she was getting to, that, you know, there is gridlock in Washington around a lot of things. And one of those has to do with elections. And so I think that we probably shouldn't count on Congress prescribing what the solutions are. And so the solutions are going to be decided at the state level. And that's why this advocacy that she mentioned is so important, because that's where the decisions will be made, and they're being made right now. And I mean, I know some people are hoping that some other bills can move that will be a bit more prescriptive. And good luck to them. I'm not betting on those, and that just makes it even more important for state action, state pressure. State action and state pressure.
Just to piggyback off something that Lee said, Lee, you mentioned, you know, the corporations and other folks, you know, providing people to work on election day. So some suggestion the National Guard might get involved in something like that. I think they did in Wisconsin to some degree. Is that what do we think about that as an option? Is that something that might be appropriate?
Well, they're already a resource for the government that the government can readily mobilize for resource or manpower deficient government operations, and the administration of elections clearly a government operation. I prefer to have civilians standing in precincts, checking people in through poll books, but you know, the National Guard are local citizens and they can do it as well. I think it is just one resource that states can look at if they really need people. I mean, these are good local citizens from the local community who are available to the government for you know, when the need arises. And whether the need is reached that level of critical need will be a decision for each state and locality to, you know, make a determination about.
Myrna, I think you've brought this up, and I think Charles as well, but just this idea that, you know, going back to just mail-in absentee, you know, balloting, there is a risk that a lot of those, or a higher number of those ballots end up getting rejected because of someone didn't sign their name right, or they didn't put their street right. And, you know, I think that's also maybe an important part of this discussion, that just if you give people the option to mail in a ballot, you know, potentially that ballot may not actually be counted if there's some sort of problem with it.
So Charles has done the data on where in the pipeline problems tend to go wrong. So I'll let him speak to that. I will speak on the larger fundamental right to vote issue, which is that eligible Americans need to have a meaningful opportunity to cast a ballot that'll count. And for some voters, it is going to be an in-person option. That is going to be the better way for them to have security that their ballot counted. But that should not get states a free pass to not make their own systems and not look at their own systems and figure out where Americans are getting caught up in it. We do need election administrators to look at the various places in the pipeline. And again, Charles has done an excellent job of telling people where things get messed up for voters and work around that. We can't be satisfied with business as usual, because the reality is that there are going to be more people needing a vote by mail option. And if you are a state that has a lot of votes rejected because people turn them in late, you need to work with your post office, and you need to make sure that voters know what the deadlines are. If you are a state that gets a lot of what we would call signature comparison rejections, where people are looking at what you signed to register to vote and what you signed on your mail ballot, you need to make sure that you don't have any systematic or implicit bias that goes into how those signatures are being evaluated. I don't want us to be in a position where accurately assessing growth opportunities gives people a pass to not do better, because they always needed to do better. There's just a heightened urgency to do better now, because more people are going to be looking at the vote by mail system.
Yes, if I jump in there, since my name was invoked, and just say very quickly, I mean, I think the simple way to think about it, as Myrna was suggesting, is a pipeline that is leaky, and the mail pipeline is a longer pipeline than the in-person pipeline, and so some requests don't get received, some ballots you get mailed back don't get received at the other end, some signatures don't get confirmed. Some people make mistakes on their ballots that they can't correct. And so there's like nibbling away a point here, a point there, of the chance that your vote won't be counted. And that's why in normal times, I mean, as Matt was noting earlier, states that have moved to all vote by mail have done so deliberately and by putting in systems to try to minimize these issues. We are in an emergency where the choice may not be, whether purely convenience. The choice may be taking what slight risk there is in the mail route and comparing that against the serious health issues and the fact that you might not vote at all. And so that's why we're talking about, kind of being willing to, kind of be more generous with the mail balloting this time, pressing on the locals and the state officials to do as well as they can. But the laws of physics, I think, tell us that they are not going to be able to get to the level of proficiency that the long-standing vote by mail states have gotten to.
Yes, and Kyle, I'll add, we were discussing the resources needed just to run election day. When you back up the election with early and absentee voting for 30 or 45 days, the processing of applications, the receipt of the envelopes, the processing of those envelopes is a person-intensive operation. And these election registrars at the local levels are going to need extra resources and really just manpower for 30 to 45 days before an election to do the processing. I don't know all the leaky parts in the system, but I can tell you, having litigated recounts and election contests and pulled the actual absentee voter logs after an election, you can see that already in certain cities of Virginia, for example, I've seen long delays from the receipt. The log will tell you when they received the application and then when they mailed back the absentee ballot. And sometimes you'll see as long as a month delay in just processing one application. You can, in many of those cases, you can then see the ballot returned to the local registrar within, say, 5 or 6 days of its mailing out, and yet it came in late. And the long delay was at the hands of the registrar. So we shouldn't consider universal mail voting as a panacea that's going to solve this problem. Many people are, in fact, disenfranchised by a vote by mail system. And that's why I agree with Myrna that we need to have all of the voting options in place for people to exercise their right in a way that best suits them, including on election day.
Matt, I think you were trying to jump in there.
Yeah, so Charles invoked my name, so I'm going to have my thought too. I agree that we should be as expansive as possible. I want to talk about the options a little bit on the National Guard. I agree. I'd rather have civilians. I think there are creative pools of available workers, and we should make sure we do that. But as everyone saw in Wisconsin, the way they were able to open polling places certainly had a disparate impact. Certain jurisdictions like Milwaukee had very few polling places open because they couldn't staff them. That doesn't seem very fair for their voters when you had voters in Madison had many, many voting options. So we have to make sure that when we're doing this, we're also doing it fairly across the jurisdiction. To talk about the absentee voting a little bit, some of the things that people don't realize, we don't have great laws that kind of set up voters and election administrators for failure in many cases. And there are numerous states where voters can request absentee ballots, in the 5 or so days before election day. Is that being as accessible as possible, or is it setting up voters for failure because they're probably not going to get that ballot in time? So I agree with Myrna that the voters need to know when the deadlines are true, but we also have to be honest about what it means. if voters are sending back their ballots on Saturday before Election Day, and their state requires that it be received by the close of polls, and the policymakers aren't going to change that deadline, we need to be clear that the service standards for the U.S. Postal Service mean you should really be mailing that ballot back a week before Election Day at the very latest. And I don't know if we're going to hear that from election officials, but I think that we do need to hear that from public officials.
We got some questions that were submitted by readers, and here's someone from Twitter, Jacob Beaupre, who asked a very basic question, but one that, particularly in light of primaries being postponed and other things, I think is actually kind of a legitimate thing that I think some people are concerned about. And the simple question is, will there be an election? And first, let me just give a little background here. So the date of the federal election is set by federal law, and Congress set it all the way back in 1845. And the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And so that is, if Congress, I guess hypothetically, could change that, but that is something that is an edict from Congress from almost 2 centuries ago. But does anyone have any thoughts on how sure people should be that the election will be when it normally is, and if it could possibly be moved?
I'm just going to say there better be an election, and there will be. I would feel very sorry for the entities in power that would try to not make that happen, because there are going to be a lot of voter advocates who have the voters back and are going to do every single thing we can to make sure that voters are protected and that the fundamental right to vote is protected. And I just want voters, anyone who's listening, to be assured that the Brennan Center has your back, and we are going to do everything we can to make sure that there's going to be a smooth November election.
Yeah, if the zombies are walking the streets and the asteroids are raining down on us November 3rd, we're still going to have an election. And that's one of the reasons why planning right now for a resilient election is so important. Right now, we have the flexibility of state law and party rules to delay primaries, but we don't have that in November. And that's why we have to absolutely get this planning right now, because we have no choice.
One other little technical point, well, it's not really a little point, it's the major point, is that the president's term does run out on January 20th, 2021, and the terms for the House run out in early January, and also the senators on the ballot. And so even if you were to move the election, if Congress were to agree to do it, it would have to be pretty close to the current date. And again, I think the panelists are correct that seems pretty unlikely. One thing that also comes up when, I think, in any discussion of mail-in voting, and this is sometimes a point of contention between the two parties, is what potential is there for fraud in absentee and mail-in in ballots? Voter fraud does sometimes come up, although it doesn't seem to be that common in the United States. Although I guess it is worth noting that the last big kind of election fraud scandal we had in the United States involved mail ballots in a North Carolina congressional race in 2018 that eventually forced that race to be run over again in 2019. So any thoughts on the potential concerns about fraud, particularly if mail-in voting was expanded?
Lee, did you want to jump in?
Go right ahead.
Okay, I was going to say we need to. This is an issue that requires appropriate risk assessment. There is, I think, little dispute that when an election is run in a sloppy way, there are lots of opportunities for things to go wrong. But when an election is run well and the processes are run well and people have foresight and forethought and are thinking about how to do this, the elections can be run through a satisfactory level of security. As a general matter, fraud in the American election system has been very, very rare for a long period of time. And the states that do all vote by mail have a number of security procedures in place that are available to other states as they are expanding vote by mail options.
Yeah, I'll just add, let me echo what Myrna said. Having been involved in elections at the granular level and doing archaeology on elections in both election contest and recounts, the number one problem that I've seen is sloppy election administration. Sloppy election administration disenfranchises more people than fraud does. Now, fraud is a legitimate concern. We just had an election invalidated in North Carolina in the 9th Congressional District over the abuse of absentee ballots. There's a famous or infamous 1997 mayoral election in Miami that was invalidated because of the abuse of absentee ballots. And as we, the ideal election administration, both for giving everyone a secure mechanism to vote and also preventing any abuse or fraud in the system, is the vote in person on election day in a precinct. And that's always been the gold standard. Over the decades, we have expanded mechanisms for voting, and every time we have tried to institutionalize in those mechanisms integrity provisions and protocols. And I think this is one reason why I prefer the Virginia system, which has gone from a fairly expansive excuse voting to now it's going to be just early voting if you so choose. But I think that's what it had practically become in any event. But there are several mechanisms in place where the voter, the individual voter, has to apply for the ballot, has to receive it, has to sign things. I would support moving away from signatures. I find the signatures on absentee balloting to be incredibly a subjective review by people who are not signature experts. I think barcoding or QR coding of the outer envelopes would probably be a better system to look at the the chain of custody and where that ballot came from. But we have these mechanisms in place. I think states that are looking at expanding mail voting ought to look at what is tried and true and what's been established in other places. And there are many examples of those systems in place, including keeping a log of the absentee ballots as well.
One other thing I think sometimes comes up and is probably not something we're close to or maybe ever will be close to, but is there any possibility of voting online? And I think maybe some members of the military can do that, but is that something that would be at all on the horizon for anywhere in November?
No.
Okay.
Next question. Now,
is it something that you can imagine in 10, 20 years or what are the sorts of issues with it? Because I guess a lot of people might think, hey, I could do my banking on my phone. I could do this or that on my phone. Why can't I vote on my phone?
Yeah, there are three fundamental problems. One is you can kind of think about three problems with the technology we have now, and it's likely to be the technology we have certainly for the next decade, if not longer. You as a voter cannot be 100% certain that you're actually dealing with the legitimate website, which is the election office, and getting the ballot or getting any information. The election office can't be 100% certain that they're getting something from a legitimate voter. And there's things called monkey in the middle attacks, such that people, nefarious people or accidents can occur such that the transmission of ballots and other information between the voter and the central voting office can be interrupted. And so there's all sorts of technological problems that emerge, which all go back to the secret ballot and these other applications such as banking, et cetera. There is no secrecy in there, or even, proxy voting and some other things that we do. There's generally not secrecy there. And so, the technology colleagues that I've talked with have remarked, some of them have said, one day there may be internet voting, but they also say, the cryptographers I talk to say that actually the voting problem is the hardest problem to solve in this space. And so it will probably be the last thing that we do online safely and securely. And for a general population, we can argue about the special use cases currently, but for the entire population, I think the consensus is that that's not ready for prime time.
That also dovetails with what, if we were holding this panel, I don't know, 6 months ago or something, maybe we would have been talking about, security concerns foremost and hacking by foreign agencies and those sorts of things, which are still things that could possibly happen, but not, I guess, at the forefront. And certainly if there was an online voting system, to your point, you'd think that there would be considerable threats on that. Matt, I have a question for you. Being at the Bipartisan Policy Center, it seems like the parties really go at it in terms of, access to voting, voter ID, things like that. And these are longstanding battles that have been going on for a long time. And I think will probably be a feature of whatever sorts of battles we see this year over these elections. As someone at the Bipartisan Policy Center, is there common ground between the parties on how to deal with this going forward? And are there things that the both sides can agree to in the event that, some states and the federal government have already tried to expand options and provide more money, but what avenues for agreement are there?
Yeah, I think at the federal level, we often break down into our two camps, and that's likely to keep happening at the federal level. But if you look at the progress different states are making, these don't break down so evenly along partisan lines. Some of the states that have, all vote by mail, which seems to be right now the kind of thing that Republicans in Congress don't want to do. You have Washington State, which has a Republican Secretary of State. You have Utah, which no one is going to claim to be a Democratic state, at the forefront of offering those options. When we're talking about actually serving voters, in my experience, the majority of election officials didn't get into the field. The ones who are actually administering the elections, at least, didn't get into the field to try to limit the options. So I do think that there's the politics, but there's actually how to administer the elections well. And I do think election officials know how to do it. And so getting the voices of election officials to those policymakers is a lot of what my team at the Bipartisan Policy Center does to make sure they're having a comprehensive view of what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, it is interesting in that we see the sort of expanding voting versus not expanding voting has become this sort of partisan issue. But if you look at some of the states that have a lot of options, they aren't necessarily all red states or all blue states. I think of places like Arizona and Florida, but then also some places in the Northeast that we think of as being very Democratic sometimes haven't had great options.
Right, and I'll add that the federal government, while I think some might argue they should be taking the lead on these things, the states have often done this themselves, and they've banded together to do it themselves as well. Some of the biggest advancements in registration have happened because the states themselves banded together to create an interstate compact to share data across state lines to make sure eligible but unregistered voters were being reached out to when they moved to new states. That had nothing to do with the federal government. That was states realizing there's a need. And that program now has a majority of the states signed on, blue, red, purple, everything. And so, again, I do think that when election officials are given the opportunity to work together, even across state lines, some common ground does rise to the top.
And I'm hopeful that the Wisconsin experience will signal to all politicians that voters care about voting. And even in the face of a pandemic, voters are going to assert their right to vote. And I hope the politicians that are not looking creatively for ways to come together take heed of the fact that their voters care and that their voters want to be able to have an election in which they don't have to choose between their fundamental right to vote and being safe and healthy.
I wanted to provide or go to another reader question, which is kind of a sweeping question from E. Pankowski on Twitter, and he asks, "What are the minimum requirements for an election to be quote unquote legitimate when held in the midst of a crisis like this one?" And I think there already are some people, I think, on both sides, maybe rightly or wrongly, who feel like there are some legitimacy problems with how American elections are conducted, and now we have this whole new variable that we're throwing into the mix. And so how do we project or protect, I guess, and project the legitimacy of the election and whatever the results end up being?
If no one else wants to go first, I can start. Legitimacy is always a concern. You could talk about structural issues, about the process itself. I mean, should we have ranked choice voting? Is that more legitimate? That way we always have a majority winner. So we're going to have to define down what legitimacy means. So the way I look at it, and maybe not everyone would agree with this, is are the rules clear for that state ahead of time? Is the state adhering to rules that are well established, well noticed, and are they allowing everyone to access the polls equally? Again, we're gonna have different ways of evaluating that, but I do think that's one way of looking at legitimacy. I do think my concern about the election and the concerns of legitimacy are going to happen probably in the days after Election Day, as the vote counting happens. I think that most of us on this panel would agree that the vote counting process is professionalized. States know how to do it. In many states, it takes a while. California takes 28 days. States that have a lot of absentee ballots take a little bit more time. As we're going to see more absentee voting this fall, no matter what. Again, absent any policy changes that states might be considering doing or will do or won't do, we're going to see more absentee voting. And states that are going to be dealing with way more paper ballots coming back to the mail than they're used to, there's going to be a window after Election Day where we don't have results from some states, I think. We might not be able to call winners. And that void is going to be filled by incentivized partisans on both sides to attack the process, to call it illegitimate, to say we should go back to the results that happened on election night. And that's a concern of mine, because that void is going to be hard to push back against, and those comments. And so to me, I am concerned about that period and the perception of legitimacy after Election Day.
Go ahead.
Well, Kyle, I was just going to add, I don't think that the extra time it may take to process these ballots necessarily has to invite cynicism. In many states, they take a good week or so after an election as it is to process votes, to process provisional ballots, to check the bona fides behind absentee ballots before they are rejected, for example, allow people the ability to come in and plead their case on their provisional ballots. And so in Virginia, we have a mandated 1-week canvass period after an election, which I've always appreciated for providing greater integrity and confidence in the results. If you recall, in 2000, recounts were being conducted the day after the election. Actual recounts are being conducted in some of those localities. In Virginia, we take an entire week and we don't certify a result. And the parties, the respective candidates and parties have a chance to observe the canvasses, to observe the counting and processing of ballots, and that actually instills greater confidence in the process. And I hope that we will get to that type of process, particularly if there's transparency in the process.
I mean, I think the only thing that I would add is that we would be asking the question, was the election free? Was the election fair? Was the election accessible? And was the outcome one that was secure or accurate? And I think we need to work very hard to make sure that the answers to all of those questions are yes. I think entangled in those questions are not simply a matter of coronavirus, but could cause us to look at a number of ways in which our election system can be improved. But what I think is really important to remember is that if there's one silver lining from this horrible pandemic we're in, it's that it has laid bare those places in our country, not just in our elections, but in our systems of governance, where we have growth opportunities. And the kind of contingency planning, the kind of resiliency formation that we need was something that the country needed in any instance, because right now it is the coronavirus, but next year it could be a tornado or hurricane. The next year it could be Russian cyber criminals attacking our infrastructure. Our elections are the way we resolve our political differences. They're the way we set the direction of the country. And for that reason, we need to make sure that they can withstand whatever sort of emergency befalls us in modern times.
Just to add a little point here, we do already have some instances where, again, it does take a long time to count the ballots, and and in some cases, the person leading election night is not always the person who leads at the end. And Arizona is one state where that happened in 2018. Also, House races in California, this frequently happens every couple years. There's a contested House race. Usually, the late votes counted are more Democratic, and that's not necessarily a question of fraud. It's just sort of the way that the votes come in. And sometimes winners on election night don't always end up being the winners at the end. The last question I would have, and it was sort of related to that, and Wisconsin maybe is instructive on this too, but on one hand, I was sort of impressed that Wisconsin counted as quickly as it did, but on the other hand, Wisconsin also had basically 6 extra days to actually do the counting, and maybe was able to get some of it accomplished then. Should we expect more states not to really be definitive on election night if in fact there are more of these kinds of mail-in options and those sorts of things?
Well, it really depends on the state laws. And actually, I wasn't in Wisconsin, and my colleagues who are in Wisconsin will no doubt correct me, but I believe in Wisconsin, actually, they didn't use those 7 days counting ballots. In Wisconsin, I believe you, like in Massachusetts and many other states, you end up commingling the mail ballots with the election day ballots and counting them all at the same time. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that Wisconsin has this law about wanting all the ballots in by election day, because they have these other laws that follow from that. I mean, better or worse, all the laws work together in a particular way. And so I think the first answer is that, well, state laws are of a certain sort, and some of them, like Virginia, like Massachusetts, like New Hampshire, are set up assuming everything that comes in by election day, everything is opened at the precinct on election day and counted at the precinct on election day, and you walk away and you can certify within less than a week. Other places, some places, I mean, the case right now that's gotten some attention is Michigan, where there's a prohibition against processing absentee ballots until election day. And by processing, we mean, taking the privacy envelope out of the mailer envelope and doing basic stuff like that. And so if you can't start doing the paperwork before election day, it's going to be really dragged out. And that's one thing if you have 10% of your ballots by mail. If you have 80% of your ballots by mail, it's really going to be something else. And so it's a long way of saying the answer to your question really depends on state by state, understanding the laws and how they interact with having a lot of mail, and whether they were written assuming they were having a lot of mail or not. And states are not going to be able to comprehensively redo their election code between now and November. And so I think we just have to be ready for a lot of unusual, unexpected things to happen.
Final question, and anyone can take this one. And this is that, I think problems are probably going to be inevitable in this election. What are you going to be looking for that might indicate that something, either in advance of the election or on the election day, what indications might there be that something has really gone wrong? That some of the things that Myrna laid out as, what are the signs of a good election? Maybe, what might be signs that we haven't handled this maybe the way that we should have?
Well, I'll start. I mean, my answer to that question is always, we know something will go wrong, we just don't know what it is. And so, which is one way of punting the question. But I think that, we know the indicia of a poorly run election, and everybody knows that. And election officials try to basically fight the last war and make sure that things that happen in the past don't happen in the future. And so, so it will be something. Long lines, mail snafus, power outages. You can go down the list, but which one is dominant? There could be a hurricane in Florida on election day. I mean, there's a number of things. And so I don't want to speculate other than to say, there's always something.
You mentioned a zombie attack earlier too, so hopefully not that.
That's one I'm pretty good on, but not asteroids. I mean, asteroids.
There you go. Who knows? Unless there are any final thoughts, I just want to thank the panel for joining us today. And of course, this is a topic that I think is going to be front of mind for all of us from now into the election, as we figure out how significant the pandemic is, how long it lasts, whether it comes back, and what sort of impact it has on the election. So again, thank you all for watching and for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.